Crimea functions as the logistical spine and the strategic anchor of Russia's southern war. Historically, this territory gave Moscow immense power projection. From the ports of Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet dominated the region, raining missiles down on the Ukrainian coastline for years. Military doctrine suggests that reclaiming a heavily fortified peninsula like this requires a massive, traditional frontal assault, an operation that would demand hundreds of thousands of troops and result in catastrophic casualties. Ukraine does not have a traditional deep-water navy, and they lack the sheer volume of soldiers needed to survive a meat-grinder invasion against dug-in Russian defenses. Because a traditional amphibious landing is mathematically impossible for Kyiv, retaking the peninsula requires a complete reimagining of modern warfare. Retired U.S. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges suggests a different approach. His proposition relies on a specific counter-strategy. You don't breach the fortress, you starve it. This strategy of attrition requires a continuous influx of long-range precision weapons and the massive funding needed to keep them firing. That funding was deadlocked until April 2026, when the TISA party, led by Peter Magyar, secured a landslide electoral victory. This domestic defeat forced Viktor Orban to concede, and in months of obstruction and releasing a €90 billion EU logistical lifeline. With the financial and logistical pipelines finally secured, the systematic three-phase siege of the Crimean Peninsula has officially begun. Phase 1 centers on total isolation. To collapse Crimea militarily, Ukrainian forces must physically and logistically sever the peninsula from the Russian mainland. The first vector is the sea. By deploying swarms of inexpensive Magura V-5 naval drones, Ukraine hunted down Russian frigates and forced the fleet to abandon its stronghold in Sevastopol. Next, they targeted the bridge. Constant drone alerts and structural damage from underwater attacks have repeatedly halted the resupply traffic that keeps the garrison fed and armed. This leaves only the land routes through the Donbass. Ukraine keeps these final lifelines under constant bombardment, using mobile rocket platforms like the HIMARS system. When the sea, the bridge, and the land routes are choked off simultaneously, the peninsula stops functioning as a connected military base and becomes a besieged piece of land forced to fend for itself. Once the doors are locked, Phase 2 begins. The strategy shifts from isolation to making the peninsula completely unlivable for the trapped Russian troops. Ukraine uses precision Western cruise missiles to systematically blind the enemy, hunting down multi-million-dollar radar arrays and destroying advanced S-400 air defense batteries. Without air defenses to protect them, oil depots and tanks burn regularly. This leaves Russian jets grounded, ships immobile, and armored columns paralyzed. This leads to Phase 3. A ground operation at this stage is no longer a costly battle against a resilient army, but a final walk-in to mop up a weary, isolated garrison. The modern Russian army is a cumbersome machine inherited from Soviet doctrine, heavily dependent on vast logistical trains. When you strip away the fuel and the ammunition, the entire defense collapses under its own weight. Zooming out from the battlefield tactics reveals the macro stakes. What happens to the global map the day Crimea falls? For Ukraine, reclaiming the coastline normalizes Black Sea trade routes, securing billions in exports. Ukraine also gains control over vast offshore natural gas reserves, offering Europe an alternative to Russian energy. This shift eliminates Russia's capacity to threaten NATO members like Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria. Restoring Ukrainian control over the peninsula removes the primary source of Russian power projection, permanently securing Europe's energy markets and maritime borders. The consequences reach far beyond Europe. It sets a hard precedent for revisionist powers worldwide, like China eyeing Taiwan, proving that territory seized by force will be forcibly reclaimed. Inside Russia, the loss of Crimea shatters the 12-year propaganda myth that forms the foundation of Vladimir Putin's domestic power. Without the ability to export energy from the region, and having lost their most prized territorial conquest, the loyalty of the Russian oligarchs will be truly tested, as the regime's legitimacy fractures. When the peninsula finally collapses, the Kremlin will be left with only two choices: the negotiating table or a complete internal collapse of the government. The siege of Crimea aims to sever the military's logistical spine, providing the leverage needed to end the war and stabilize the international world order.